Let me, ladies and gentlemen, welcome you again. It's been a year and a half since I had the pleasure of hosting a similar gathering of heads of agencies, international financial institutions, donors, partner countries at our first review on aid for trade. And today's meeting includes many of the same faces and some new ones. And I welcome you all. I think we've gone a long way since we launched this initiative in 2005. Aid for Trade has entered into a new phase. It's living up to its promise. We are moving from making trade possible to making trade happen. And in the past 18 months, we've stressed implementation of this initiative in national and regional events. We've also refined our monitoring framework, adding work on indicators of the self-assessment procedures and monitoring of aid for trade flows. And one very gratifying outcome of this year's monitoring exercise has been the engagement of our developing countries members. Regional review meetings in the Zambia, in Jamaica, and Cambodia, which preceded this event, have underlined the commitment of partners and donors to cooperate and coordinate in this pursuit of common goals. Tangible progress is being made in turning commitments into implementation action. And tomorrow we will be showcasing 3 examples of each of these events. They provide an excellent opportunity for us to learn from successful examples across regions and make Aid for Trade into a global community of best practice. They also remind us of the growing importance of the regional dimension of Aid for Trade, which I personally believe should be at the core of our strategy moving forward. Angel Gurrìa and his team at the OECD have done another fine job in putting together our flagship publication on Aid for Trade for this meeting. The 2007 edition was groundbreaking. This year's edition should be prize-winning. Such is the depth of the analysis and the clarity of its presentation. It paints an upbeat picture of trade being prioritized by partner countries in national development strategies, of donors offering more and better aid for trade, of new partners engaging in South-South cooperation. And the increases in aid for trade, which he will announce, have been achieved without reducing resources to other development priorities such as health, education, or environment. And these are themes which will be expanded in subsequent sessions. But let me also be very candid. The global trading environment has worsened dramatically since our first review. Global trade growth of 6% in 2007, which is last time we met, has been replaced by a projected 10% contraction in 2009. And it's one of the biggest challenges that the multilateral trading system has faced since its inception. And as we all know, this crisis has a human face. Poverty alleviation targets, whether are part of the MDGs or otherwise, have become more challenging because of, among things, the decline in export demand for goods. When the recovery will begin is anyone's guess, but for everyone concerned, it's clear that it can't come too quickly. And on this, one point is clear. If aid for trade was urgent in 2007, it has become essential today. It is the investment that will allow many developed countries prepare to exit the crisis by enhancing their trade capacity. Et c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles je souhaite féliciter les institutions financières internationales et les donateurs qui sont réunis ici aujourd'hui pour les efforts qu'ils déploient, notamment depuis le début de la crise. Une des initiatives essentielles dans le cadre de laquelle nos efforts collectifs portent maintenant leurs fruits est le cadre intégré renforcé pour les PMA, les pays les moins avancés, après des mois de travaux, de longs mois de travaux, dirais-je, je me réjouis de constater qu'il est désormais pleinement opérationnel. Et pour preuve, le fait que le financement des 2 premiers projets, au profit du Yémen et du Sierra Leone, a été approuvé la semaine dernière. Un autre exemple que nous présenterons plus tard dans la journée est le programme de liquidité pour le commerce mondial. Lors des activités régionales que nous avions organisées en 2007, avant la crise actuelle, ce secteur avait déjà été identifié comme un sujet de préoccupation. Avec la crise, malheureusement, la situation s'est détériorée et ce programme de liquidité est une réaction très concrète aux contraintes qui s'exercent sur le plan de l'offre et qui est conforme au mandat que les ministres nous avaient donné à Hong Kong. Et c'est pourquoi le thème de cet examen global de cette année est entretenir l'élan. Entretenir l'élan est absolument impératif. Le processus du G20 a souligné combien il est important de respecter les engagements d'accroissement de l'aide. Il a également apporté une note optimiste avec la réaffirmation des engagements qui avaient été pris d'atteindre les objectifs du millénium pour le développement et d'honorer les promesses faites en matière d'aide au développement, y compris l'aide pour le commerce, l'allègement de la dette, les engagements de Gleneagles et notamment en direction de l'Afrique subsaharienne. Donc à nous de faire collectivement en sorte que cet engagement ne faiblisse pas et de commencer à préparer l'avenir au-delà des engagements actuels de doublement de l'aide pour le commerce d'ici à 2010. Notre regard doit commencer à se porter post-2010. La récompense, ne l'oublions pas, est l'amélioration des performances commerciales des pays en développement et en particulier des pays les plus pauvres. Le commerce doit à son tour favoriser la croissance économique qui permette aux populations de sortir de la pauvreté. Et la forte contraction des marchés d'exportation actuels ne doit pas nous faire oublier les avancées considérables qui ont été réalisées au cours de la dernière décennie en matière d'ouverture des marchés et des économies. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle la conclusion du cycle de Doha, la plus rapide possible, améliorera les possibilités d'accès au marché pour les pays qui en ont le plus besoin. Et donc l'aide pour le commerce doit permettre, notamment aux membres les plus pauvres, de tirer parti de ces nouveaux débouchés qui seront alors, si nous finissons ce round, disponibles pour une meilleure insertion de leur économie à l'international. Et donc nous devons tous nous donner pour objectif collectif de démontrer en quelque sorte ce que nous savons déjà, à savoir que cette initiative en vaut la peine, mérite d'être menée à bien parce que, en gros, ça marche. Qui peut s'en charger? À cette question, la réponse est simple. C'est vous, nos partenaires, et vous, les membres de cette organisation. Vous ferez bouger les choses en intégrant le commerce dans vos stratégies nationales de développement, en respectant vos engagements en matière d'aide et en prenant de nouveaux engagements post-2010. Vous tiendrez vos engagements en transformant ces contributions en actions concrètes et par ailleurs en menant à bien la négociation du cycle de Doha. Le rôle et l'apport du secteur privé sont essentiels pour que nos efforts soient couronnés de succès. C'est dans cet esprit que j'ai mené des consultations approfondies avec Patricia Francis, qui dirige le Centre du commerce international, sur la façon d'élaborer une stratégie un peu plus sophistiquée, un peu plus globale, visant à accroître le rôle du secteur privé, en particulier dans les pays en développement. Et ce rôle du secteur privé sera également un élément central de notre feuille de route. Pour conclure, je rappelle, s'il en était besoin, que l'Organisation mondiale du commerce n'est pas une organisation d'aide au développement, que nous n'avons pas ni la volonté, ni le mandat de devenir une organisation d'aide au développement. Nous restons déterminés à jouer notre rôle de coordinateur et nous témoignons aujourd'hui notre reconnaissance pour la manière dont vous avez tous accueilli ce rôle, accepté ce rôle et travaillé pour faire avancer cette initiative. Je dis ceci en mon nom, au nom de Valentine Guabiza, que je veux remercier publiquement devant vous pour ses efforts inlassables sur cette initiative, et aussi au nom de la petite équipe qui l'assiste avec une efficacité remarquable. Profitons des 2 jours qui viennent pour nous mettre au clair sur les prochaines étapes que nous voulons tous, j'en suis sûr, aussi porteuses, aussi ambitieuses que celle qui se terminera avec cette revue demain soir. Je vous remercie de votre attention et je vais maintenant demander à Andrel Gurrìa, le secrétaire général de l'OCDE, de prendre la parole. Il mérite compte tenu de la contribution considérable que l'OCDE, sous sa direction, apporte à notre exercice. Angel, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Pascal beckons, we all come. Huh? That's a rule among the international organizations. And we are delighted to be here now for the second time on the subject of aid for trade. In your boxes there, some of you may not have opened it, but you have the actual main document, which is the Aid for Trade 2009. It's called Maintaining Momentum. And of course, for ministers and public officials who are very busy, you have the foreword and the executive summary. But for those who are gluttons for punishment, you have the country and agency chapters, you know, one by one, institution by institution, blow by blow, which sustains the main conclusions that you see in the documentation. This adds to the regular reporting on aid and on a first report that is being done now on multilateral aid, which is always a country aid. This is the first report that we're putting out on multilateral aid. Pascal was saying we are not the agency to deal with aid flows, well, the DAC at the OECD is one of the places, not the only one. And I have to say that perhaps, Pascal, you don't want to take ownership of this, but this Aid for Trade is a success story, and I want to congratulate you for that. We will see why. It's my great pleasure to present this second OECD WTO monitoring report on aid for trade. And I emphasize in OECD WTO, it's simply because it's in alphabetical order. The publication is opened by a proverb that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. This is appropriate, as a tree, especially a fruit-bearing one, is a fitting metaphor for the benefits that countries can reap from outward-looking growth strategies. But it is easier said than done. Low-income countries often lack the basic capacity, be it in terms of policies, institutions, or infrastructures, to exploit the opportunities that more open markets present and to trade out of poverty. The goal of the Aid for Trade initiative is to help them develop this capacity. Now, this is more important than ever in the current context, as developing countries have been hit hard by the crisis. I was speaking to Mr. Kaberuka, the head of the African Development Bank. Dominique Strauss-Kahn invited us a few months ago to visit Tanzania for a meeting with all the ministers there, and we've been working on the African Economic Outlook publication that we put out every year with the African Development Bank. And clearly what we have is a very, very serious stress on the poorest countries, Africa in particular. Africa is resilient and showing a lot of capacity to resist, but this is not their doing, like it is not the doing of developing countries in general, but they are feeling the brunt of the crisis. And we should take that into consideration in our policies. Commodity prices have dropped, other than the overall drop in trade that Mr. Lamy mentioned. Trade finance dried up, remittances declined, and any effort to bring the world back to shape has to include a major element of rebalancing transfers to developing countries. Aid for Trade is a clear example of these short-term measures that have long-term impact. It is a classic double dividend that we have been promoting as good practices to get us out of the crisis. The Aid for Trade initiative, Mr. Lamy, friends, is alive, is well, is growing. Can we term it a success? I would say yes, so far, but of course we are just beginning. Since its inception, partner countries have increasingly prioritized trade in their development strategies, and donors have responded with aid to help them overcome their supply-side constraints. OECD and WTO have been working together closely to monitor how this is taking shape. Allow me to highlight some of the findings. Between 2005 and 2007, Aid for Trade flows have grown by about 20% in real terms. Total new concessional commitments which qualify as Aid for Trade. And I say this because when we launched the concept of Aid for Trade, then everything became Aid for Trade. Every bit of aid qualified, or we were asked to qualify it as Aid for Trade. Obviously, this is not the case. So in the concessional commitments which qualify as Aid for Trade, they reach more than 25 billion. Funding for global and regional programs identified as an area requiring special attention more than doubled in this period. Preliminary data for 2008 shows a continued increase on the Aid for Trade flows. We're updating the data. It's difficult to say what's happening in 2009. We have, of course, the pressure of the crisis, but we hope that the positive momentum continues. On top of that, non-concessional lending from multilaterals and regional organizations has added a further 27 billion to the trade-related financing. So you really are talking about 52 billion that was committed to the supply side of on developing countries to eliminate the constraints on the supply side. Even more important is that we have seen surprisingly high disbursement rates on aid for trade projects and programs. This is of enormous importance. Those of us who have been familiar with projects and programs with the different development banks around the world, the question of disbursements becomes a very important criteria whether we are being successful or not. In aid for trade programs, the disbursement rate has been very high, I would say surprisingly high. Now, partner countries are increasingly taking ownership of the Aid for Trade initiative. In this exercise, 2 years ago, 7 partner countries responded to the questionnaire. This year, almost 90 countries participated in the monitoring exercise, and the majority of these countries assess that they are mainstreaming trade in their developing strategies. This effort should continue. In the context of the economic crisis and given the competing claims on limited donor resources, the increased engagement by partner countries will help secure continued funding of the Aid for Trade priorities. But donors are also responding. Last time when we reported, there were 43 donors. Now we have 57 bilaterals and also multilateral donors. And Aid for Trade is becoming a mainstream in their aid programs. Now, we have seen that health flows are holding, education flows are holding, and it was said here that, that perhaps this is being additional. I think we should strive for that. We should make sure that Aid for Trade is not a substitute of flows that were already being channeled and simply now have a different name. The crisis is conspiring against this, and we should be very, very vigilant. The donors, we ask you please to take a hard look at this so that we're not recycling the same amounts of money. The idea of Aid for Trade was precisely to provide additionality. Donors are complying substantially with our Hong Kong Aid for Trade pledges. They have also pledged to maintain the aid flows. We have written, myself and the head of the DAC, to the leaders of the countries that are providing most of the aid, and they have all said we will maintain them. They also said so in the G20, and they've made a number of pledges so far, so we hope that they maintain. But the problem is, if anything, with the crisis, the needs of the poorest countries in the world, including the Africans, have increased. So perhaps just maintaining would not be enough under normal conditions. The crisis, again, makes this difficult, but it also should be an encouragement for us to do better. So the second monitoring exercise is putting a spotlight on a number of positive developments. Coordination and delivery mechanisms are better. They're better oiled, if you will. Aid is now more predictable and sustainable. We're getting reports about, yes, I intend to provide this year, perhaps next year, and even 2 or 3 years. This was non-existent in the past. We're based on partner priorities more and more. That means you, the recipient countries, are the ones who say what it should be for, aligned around their systems, and with much more harmonization among donors, including those from the South. The South-South cooperation is becoming an increasing feature of aid flows, but also of Aid for Trade in particular. Enhanced accountability has also been increasing. In fact, geometrically. This validates the WTO Task Force recommendation that the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness should guide the initiative. And better still, donors indicate that they expect their Aid for Trade allocations to continue to grow over the medium term. Now, for that to happen, we should build on the progress made. We should improve the linking of Aid for Trade to the wider development agenda and broaden and deepen the Aid for Trade dialogue. In the first case, of course, we just had the DAC meeting, and they have a plan for action. The action plan links the crisis response to long-term global objectives, and clearly Aid for Trade plays a big role, a fairly central role in these efforts. When you're talking about the need for dialogue, linking aid for trade to this more inclusive global development agenda also requires broadening and deepening the policy dialogue. We also need to identify the nature and extent of the supply-side constraints, but not in a general, but on a regional, country-by-country, case-by-case basis. Once this is done, we need to show how aid for trade can address these obstacles, working with and adding value to private sector initiatives. This was mentioned here a moment ago by Pascal. This is the natural evolution. First, we needed to know the numbers. Then we are now better informed about the needs. 90 countries on the recipient side, 57 elements on the donor side. So it means we got substantially all the universe now. And now we're going into what the numbers mean, what the needs are, the project level, the specific project level, sometimes even at the local level, not just at the national level. Where are the bottlenecks? What are the applications that are going to give us more sort of bang for the buck, as the expression goes. So these are, and the private sector, coming in with the private sector. That's, again, the next stage. The private sector has a natural role to play when you're talking about trade issues. And aid for trade, therefore, can play a big role in supporting not only the actual bottlenecks or debottlenecking, but also in being some seed money in order to get the private sector in. Ladies and gentlemen, Monsieur Lamy, my friends in the podium here, we believe this initiative can make a real contribution to our common objective of a more inclusive and environmentally sustainable world economy. The OECD will continue to work closely with the WTO to monitor aid for trade. We will collect and synthesize good practices that will help us focus aid for trade on delivering results. We'll also design a common evaluation framework to assess the aid for trade outcomes and impacts in terms of trade capacities, poverty reduction, and environmental sustainability. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I started my speech by saying that the second best time to plant a tree is now. But let us not forget about picking the low-hanging fruit of the trees that were planted a long time ago. Let us maintain momentum and finish what we started in Doha. Let us wrap up successfully the Doha Development Agenda, and through increased trade, help millions of people get out of poverty. Thank you.